On Sunday evening, July 24, 1988, in Washington, North Carolina, Bonnie von Stein settled down in front of the television to watch a rerun of the TV movie The Deliberate Stranger, about serial killer Ted Bundy. Her husband Leith had gone to bed early, her daughter Angela was in her room listening to music, and her son Chris had returned to school at North Carolina State University. But in the early hours the following morning, 911 dispatch would receive an emergency call from Bonnie. She claimed to have been beaten and stabbed by a home intruder, and her husband was lying beside her, dying. In recent years, news media has begun to reevaluate and deconstruct the Satanic Panic, a bout of mass hysteria that afflicted the United States for over a decade. But what if it wasn't just hysteria? What if some of it was true? Ritual Rewind brings you into the darkest corners of the 1980s, uncovering the crimes, conspiracies, and occult fears that shaped a generation. Tonight, we rewind it back to 1988 and dive into the murder of Leith von Stein. It's the case of the Devil and the Dungeon Master. I'm your host, Drew, and you're listening to Ritual Rewind. Bonnie was startled awake in the early hours of Monday, July 25th, by her husband Leith's screams in the bed beside her. She couldn't see anything, it was too dark, and her eyes hadn't adjusted, but his screams were piercing. She reached out to feel for him, to give him some form of comfort, and that's when she felt it, a hard strike against her hand. She reeled back and looked up. There, looming over her, was an ominous shadow of a man. He struck her twice, and she fell off the bed with a hard thump. She listened, blind, at the squelch of a knife blade stabbing her husband over and over again, until his screams ceased, and she was left in silence. She heard her attacker leave the room, and she worried that Angela would be next. Bonnie doesn't remember what happened after that, because she blacked out. She woke a little while later. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. She didn't know, because it was still dark. She couldn't see, and her head hurt. She reached up for her husband's hand. It was hanging off the side of the bed. She gripped it tightly, but the gesture wasn't reciprocated. His hand was cold and limp. She was able to crawl to her nightstand and feel for the cord to the telephone. She pulled it down on top of her, another painful blow to a body that already ached. It was around 4 a.m. that morning when 911 dispatch received the call from Bonnie. She pleaded with the dispatcher to please send help. "My husband is dying, and I think I am too." When the police arrived, they were cautious. Bonnie had been unsure if the intruder was still in the house. Police first tried the front door, but found it locked, so they circled around to the backyard, where they found the back door ajar. They entered and cleared the first floor before ascending the steps to the second. The first door they opened was Angela's. They shined their flashlights inside, and there was a body in the bed. Alive or dead, they didn't know. So when they flicked on the overhead light, you can imagine Angela's surprise when she woke up in a fright to see police officers in her room, their guns trained on her. And to the police's relief, she was alive and unharmed. But as it would later confound them, she had heard nothing at all. When the police reached Bonnie's bedroom, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, and of course, the bed. Leith was dead, a large stab wound at the center of his chest, just above his heart. Investigators would later count 6 stab wounds, a fractured skull, and a brain hemorrhage. Bonnie's injuries would include a stab wound to her chest, a collapsed lung, and a fractured thumb. After the scene was secured and Bonnie was rushed to the hospital, police began to search for clues. The house hadn't been ransacked, and nothing seemed to have been stolen. None of the computers, none of the TVs, and not even the $20 bill that rested on the Von Stein's dresser. The police estimated that the intruder most likely entered and exited through the back door. And on the back porch, abandoned at the door, was a military-styled backpack. Police questioned Angela to see if there was anyone that may have wanted to have her mother and father killed. Angela corrected them. It was her mother and her stepfather. Her biological father was Stephen Pritchard, a long-haul trucker based in South Dakota. And no, she didn't know of anyone who would want them dead. Fearing that Bonnie's attacker would learn of her survival and come back to finish the job, around-the-clock protection was placed outside her hospital room. Angela called her brother, Chris, at his dormitory at North Carolina State, where he was enrolled in summer school. She told him that he needed to get his butt home, that their parents had been attacked. In a panic, Chris couldn't find the keys to his car, and he called the university's emergency line, hysterical, and begged them to drive him to his home. They did. His roommate would later find the keys underneath a cushion in their bedroom. When Chris arrived home, he visited his mother at the hospital and then went to a friend's home. He refused to speak with the police and seemed to actively avoid them, which to the police seemed strange. In fact, to them, the whole family seemed strange. Leith and Bonnie met while working at Intagon, an insurance company. They shared a similar interest in computers. Bonnie had 2 children from her marriage to Steve, Chris, who was born in 1968, and Angela, who was born in 1970. Steve remained absent from his children's lives until they reached high school. Leith quit his job at Intagon and started working as an auditor for a conglomerate of department stores in the North Carolina area, and he did well for himself. Bonnie took a job teaching data processing at a local community college. Leith and Bonnie married, and they all moved in together. But the relationship between Leith and his stepchildren was fraught, especially with Chris. And the siblings shared a nickname for their stepfather: Asshole. Tensions between Chris and Leith had escalated by the time Chris had reached his teens, and it mainly had to do with Chris's schooling and his grades. Chris struggled in school, and not because of any intellectual disability. He was an extremely smart and bright kid. It's just that he didn't give a damn. His failure at school was largely attributed to his intense focus and obsession with the game Dungeons and Dragons. It's all that occupied his mind. He played it regularly with his friends since he was 11 years old. Chris graduated from high school in June of 1987 and enrolled in North Carolina State University for the fall of that year. It was in college that he would meet 2 friends who shared an equally strong interest in Dungeons and Dragons, James Upchurch and Neil Henderson. James Upchurch, who had his friends call him Moog, was born in 1968, and like Chris, he was abandoned by his biological father at a young age. He was extremely intelligent, with a tested IQ of 135. Upchurch grew up as a shy introvert and routinely lost himself in books, gravitating mostly to the sci-fi and fantasy genres, and that was how he discovered Dungeons and Dragons. Something about Upchurch that would interest police later was that he had a fondness for military-styled gear, including a backpack that held his D&D paraphernalia. Neil Henderson was an academically gifted student from the School of Science and Math at North Carolina State University, and he had a very antisocial personality. He lived under the personal motto, "You've got it, I want it, and I will kill you for it." Those who knew him would later describe him as calm but sneaky. He wasn't physical, but he was always thinking. It was Upchurch that discovered the tunnels beneath North Carolina State. To them, it felt like their own personal cave system in the underbelly of the university, and the boys explored them almost every night. They dressed up and acted out their D&D campaigns with increased fervor. And with the help of ample amounts of LSD, reality and fantasy began to merge together and became inseparable. It was later revealed by a minister at North Carolina State that Chris had suffered from some mental problems because of his time playing D&D inside those tunnels. And it was in those tunnels that the boys developed a D&D campaign that would alter their lives and the lives of the von Stein family forever. Upchurch was the dungeon master, and the author of the campaign. He drew up a map to a castle ruled by an evil overlord with vast amounts of treasure, and sent the group on their journey. And according to the campaign, the group found a secret underground passage that led them into the bedroom of the evil overlord. The dungeon master gave the group orders to kill, and so they beat and stabbed the overlord until he was dead, and reclaimed his treasure. And while they spent all night in the tunnels, Chris and Upchurch skipped their classes, and their grades suffered. By the time the spring semester of 1988 ended, Chris had a grade point average of 1.3. Upchurch's grades were so bad that he was notified by the school that he was no longer welcome at the institution, infuriating the boys' respective parents. The university did offer the two boys a lifeline. They could be reinstated to good standing if they enrolled in summer courses and finished with passing grades. Both enrolled in summer school, but Upchurch quickly dropped his classes and spent his summer immersed in Dungeons & Dragons. Thanks to his declining grades, Leith and Chris would often get into verbal arguments that disintegrated into physicality, with Leith offering to fight Chris on multiple occasions. Bonnie was concerned and pleaded with Chris to seek out psychological support, and he obliged. But it only took a few sessions before the psychologist diagnosed Chris with serious emotional problems that stemmed from his senior year in high school, and she recommended that he drop out of school until he faced those issues head-on. Chris did not follow the psychologist's recommendation. Shortly before the murder, Leith had received a large inheritance totaling nearly $1 million. That, in addition to the life insurance on both Bonnie and Leith, the inheritors, Angela and Chris, would be due for a substantial windfall of almost $2 million. For police, this immediately cast suspicion on the two children. But Angela and Bonnie both passed lie detector tests, and Chris refused to take one. When investigators did get to speak with Chris, he chain smoked through the entire interview and was extremely fidgety and nervous. They questioned him on what he was doing the days leading up to his parents' attack, and according to Chris, he had returned home from college on that Friday night to hang out with his family, and then he returned to campus that Sunday afternoon to work on a term paper that was due the following day. But instead of working on the paper, he drank and played cards with friends early into the morning. Police were then made aware that prior to leaving his parents' home in Washington, Chris and Leith had had another drag-out fight over his grades. Leith laid down an ultimatum: pass this semester or that would be it. He wouldn't pay for Chris to flunk out another semester. Bonnie was released from the hospital on August 1st, 1988, just a week after the attack on her life. By then, the investigators had already grown suspicious of her son, but Bonnie waved those concerns away. She loved her son, and her son loved her, and he would never have hurt her or Leith. She did offer her ex-husband, Steve Pritchard, as a possible suspect. Leith and Steve had gotten along fine when together, but Steve had recently had a turn of bad luck with his trucking business and needed money badly. She thought that maybe he could have concocted a scheme to get the money he needed from his children's inheritance. But what no one knew besides Bonnie, Leith, and their attorney was that any inheritance was to be placed in a trust and would not be able to be accessed by Chris or Angela until they were 35 years of age. Speculation in the community was that Chris, Angela, and Bonnie were members of a local satanic cult and that Leith was murdered to help fund that cult. There was no actual proof of this, but shortly before the murders, the local police department had received special training in how to spot satanic groups, and one of the lead investigators connected the murders to a holiday honoring Papa Ogua, a voodoo deity who required blood sacrifices. None of this had any real connection to the murders, and the police refocused their interest on Chris and his friends. The break in the case came from a pig farmer named Lee Murphy. Murphy had been returning home from a drop-off early on Monday, July 25th, when he spotted a fire off-road. The location was 15 minutes away from the Von Stein home. And as a former volunteer fireman, Murphy went to investigate. But what he found wasn't a raging fire. It was a small pile of debris that smelled as if gasoline had been used as an accelerant. Murphy immediately got spooked. He felt that the person who set this fire did so to hide something, and that maybe that person didn't want it to be found. So Murphy left. It wasn't until he saw the murder on the news that he thought what he found might be of interest to the police. But by the time the police arrived at the scene of the fire, a brush cutting crew had already been there and cleared the area, scattering the debris all over the place. But after a long and tedious search, the investigators were still able to find evidence that would help them solve this case. They uncovered a hunting knife, bloody clothing, and a wadded-up piece of paper, which appeared to be a map. Neil Henderson was the first to waive his rights and confess. According to Henderson, Chris warned them that his parents were about to disinherit him because he was flunking out of school. And if this plan didn't come together, Chris would have to find a job. Henderson claimed his only role in the matter was to be the driver, and Upchurch would be the one to commit the murders. Chris would remain at NC State to create an alibi for himself, and then all three would share in the inheritance. One plan that they had concocted was to have Chris put sleeping pills into his parents' food before killing them, so that they would be subdued. But then Chris decided it would be better that he was not at home at the time of the murders. Another idea they had was to start an electrical fire by jamming an extra fuse into the fuse box and burning the house down with Chris's parents inside. But they settled on a simple, botched robbery and assault. Chris drew a map of his neighborhood so that Upchurch and Henderson knew where to go. Upchurch entered Chris's home through the back door with a key that Chris had provided. Upchurch was supposed to steal some jewelry to make it look like a robbery, but in the heat of the moment, Upchurch had forgotten. On the way to the Von Stein house, Upchurch was excited for the adventure. It was as if he was living a real-life Dungeons & Dragons campaign. And when asked what they should do with Chris's sister Angela if she was at the house, Chris shrugged.
If she's there, then I guess do her too.
After the murder, when Upchurch returned to the car, he was exhilarated, and he told Henderson,
I did it. I can't believe I did it. I never want to see that much blood again for the rest of my life.
Unfortunately for the boys, Upchurch and Henderson heard the news the following morning that Bonnie had survived, and they realized that Chris wouldn't be inheriting anything, and that they would never be paid for their efforts. Henderson ultimately agreed to plead guilty and accept the judge's sentencing terms in exchange for testifying against Upchurch and Chris. Henderson was sentenced to 6 years for the assault on Bonnie and 40 years for the murder of Leith. As the trial date neared, Chris pled guilty, but Upchurch decided to take his chances at trial, and he lost. He was sentenced to death. Afterwards, Bonnie released a statement to the reporters. The events of the past 18 months have been tragic for me and my family. We have endured sorrows beyond any I have ever known before. I loved my husband Leith, and I loved our quiet life together. Now my son and his 2 friends have been sentenced for participating in this tragedy. I love Chris. I hope and pray that these 3 young men can someday find peace within themselves. We now have to face the difficult task of picking up our lives and trying to move forward. In the end, Upchurch's sentence was reduced from the death penalty to life in prison. Henderson was released from prison in the year 2000, and Chris was paroled on June 2nd, 2007, and he returned home to live with his mother, Bonnie. Chris said this of the murder.
It took me years to get my head screwed on straight. I have done an appropriate amount of time, and that's my view of it.
In researching this episode, we relied on the books Cruel Doubt by Joe McGinnis and Blood Games by Jerry Bledsoe, as well as court reports. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Ritual Rewind. I'm looking to grow this podcast, so if you like it, please rate it and review it. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, give it a like and a comment. And as always, you can interact with us at The Ritual Rewind on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.